I wasn't actually going to do a video on the Pentyrch incident. I looked at it and I thought, no, this is not a UFO incident. This is a couple of people that were overawed by having a military exercise on their doorstep. I suspect they know that's what it is. They may not have known that at the time, but it may have dawned on them that what they were actually looking at was a military exercise, the use of military flares, and they've, having started the UFO story, they've stuck with it because they thought, well, we can get some presentations out of it, maybe out of it. I don't know if they actually do sell a book, do they, and DVDs, that sort of stuff, but they might have thought they could make a few quid out of it and become sort of micro-famous, like a lot of these UFO presenters. So they decided to run with it. Does Kaz really believe it was a UFO incident today? I'd be surprised. It may be the case that she really does believe she saw a UFO, an interdimensional vehicle or alien spacecraft. She saw military flares and was just overawed by it and really believes that's what she saw. That would explain her passing a polygraph, because remember, you know, it doesn't have to be the truth. You just have to believe it. So if she believes it to be true, she would pass a polygraph. To be perfectly honest, I would. I mean, even if she was strapped to a polygraph and asked specific questions about the incident, rather than this rather fudgy test she's done, I would still say the same thing. I would say, well, you know, she may well believe it, but that doesn't mean that's what she's describing is an alien spacecraft or an interdimensional spacecraft. The patterns of military flares. Anyway, we'll deal with it sort of one at a time, and we'll just look at what she's saying, and then we'll look at a logical, down-to-earth explanation of what she's describing, and you can make your own minds up. But anyway, I think it's rather sad that this is described, the Pentyrch incident is described here as the biggest UFO event of modern times. Because there is nothing to it. It's very much like Roswell. You know, I don't think there's anything to that either, and it sort of got blown out of all proportion. But anyway, this is I'll leave a link to this video below so you can watch it in its entirety. This is I think this is the Swansea one. I'll have to take my hands off the camera to scroll it up, but I'll leave a link to it below. This video here is 2 hours and 4 minutes 14 seconds long. Okay. Now, I think this in itself, this comment in itself is quite telling.
About that time was when the incident started.
Yeah. Oh, that's when you saw the green light going off, isn't it?
That's when the pyramid first started to appear.
Yeah, but a few minutes after that, then the green light went over.
The whole incident took about 4 minutes.
Yeah. And
the whole incident took about 4 minutes. So she's doing quite well. She's getting lots of presentations out of it. This video is 2 hours long, so the presentation was 2 hours long, all describing a 4-minute incident. Yeah, okay. All right, well, let's just have a look at some of the things she has to say. Oh, actually, before that, I just want to show you something, something else, and then we'll have a look at what she's got to say, and a down-to-earth explanation of what she's actually describing. Okay, so the images I'd seen of this Pentyrch UFO, or the renditions I'd seen, are like this. So you have the lights coming down at the sides like this, and it's curved at the bottom like that. This is very much, I'll show a video of some military parachute flares, but this is very much, very, very similar to the way military parachute flares appear in the sky. They would appear down here like this and down here like this, and it does actually appear that the lights are curved, the flares prescribe a curve at the bottom, and I think that I think what she was looking at is undoubtedly military parachute flares. Now, interestingly, this may have occurred to them. Someone may have said, hey, you know, this looks an awful lot like military parachute flares. Got sides there, and you've got the curvature at the bottom. Because if we scroll up to the video that Ben did about it, suddenly it's the other way up. The curve is at the top. And we have the sides here. And it may very well be, I've seen this before, even with the triangle the other way up, so the curve is at the bottom. You've got this thing here in the background. Can't remember how she described it now, but she said it looked like something like electrical fingers or something to stop the thing hitting the ground. Well, what you've got to bear in mind, of course, is that this is a two-dimensional image of a three-dimensional scene that she's describing. So if she was standing in a field, she saw the triangle of military flares. Actually, the other one's a better. I think the other one's a better image. But I think they changed that because people were beginning to say, hey, you know, this looks a lot like military flares, so they've turned it upside down. So it looks a little less. You know, you've got the curve at the top, instead of having the curve at the bottom, because with the curve at the bottom it looks an awful lot like military flares. It's not focusing very well today. But there you go. See, originally the curve was at the bottom. Curve was at the bottom, and you've got this sort of starburst type arrangement here. And because this is a two-dimensional image of she's describing a three-dimensional scene, this could very well be some sort of starburst flare behind here somewhere. Or it could be that the flare at the bottom, this particular flare exploded. Parachute flares are coming down, that one might have just burst. And you'd had the burning, you know, like a firework snaking out all over the place at the bottom. So I think I'll show you a couple of clips of parachute flares. But there's one description that she used, I can't remember which video it was in now, where she said a light or the lights appeared to be falling like leaves, and I thought, oh dear, that's a very obvious description of a parachute flare, isn't it? So let's just have a look at, see if I can find Kaz saying that the lights were falling like leaves, and then I'll show you a couple of clips of parachute flares. Right, let's listen to Kaz describing what she saw. I think this is on the Neil Peel video. I'll leave a link to this below.
And just stopped, skipping from side to side, waiting and watching for something. We clearly knew we were there. The pyramid itself started to list to the right-hand side, and still turning very slowly anti-clockwise, started to go back the way that it.
Yeah, so it's the pyramid started to list and then turn anti-clockwise. Now, if you look at military parachute flares, I'll show you a clip, but if you look at military parachute flares falling, they form a triangular shape, and as they continue to rotate on the parachutes in a clockwise or anti-clockwise direction, it may very well appear that it gives someone the impression that it's a pyramid that's actually turning. Now, Kaz is actually standing on a gate looking at this through some trees. She tells us it was winter time and the trees were bare, but she's still looking through trees at these military flares.
This thing didn't come down from outer space. This thing appeared in space.
Yeah, so she didn't see it coming down. She just saw it appear, which is exactly how military parachute flares appear. Again, I'll show you a couple of clips. They just seem to appear, and because they're on parachutes, they will tend to rotate and form a pyramid shape. They continue to rotate, and of course they burn out very quickly. So I think military parachute flares is exactly what Kaz Clark saw while she was standing on a gate looking through trees at 2 AM, was it? Yeah.
It didn't decline. It came into our world gradually. First one light, then another. Like you're approaching another vehicle in fog. And you get...
Yeah, first one, then another. Listen to that description. And then when we look at the military parachute flares, we'll see that's exactly how they appear.
Closer so you see it's a car. No, it's a lorry, because there are more lights behind it. And that's what this was like. The pyramid, to me, appeared like it was coming down. But the truth was, the field rises to the north and is the foot of the Bath Mountain. And I stood on the 5-bar gate to get a better look through the bare trees. This is still winter time. And I was fixated on it because it was coming down. I've described it like a hand of lightning came out its craft.
Yeah, so now she's talking about this here on the corner of the triangle here, and the triangular shape, and there's a blow up of it showing it here. Now this could be a couple of things. This is a two-dimensional rendition of a three-dimensional scene that she's describing. There's the horizon, the ground's coming up. This could be as she said, this military aircraft flying around. She actually mentioned C-130s flying around. And I think at one point she actually says shortly after this she could hear the planes and they flew directly over her head. So if this could very easily be a C-130 flying towards her in the distance. So she can't hear it. But the C-130s can fire off flares from the bottom, from the sides, from the top. They can fire them all off. That really looks quite spectacular. That looks like angel fire, I think they call it, where they fire the flares out the sides, out the bottom and out the top all at the same time. But this may just be a C-130 coming towards her, firing the flares out at the bottom from a distance. So we'll have a look at a couple of clips of C-130s firing off their defensive flares. So I think that's what she's seeing here. There's a big military exercise on at the time. Remember, military exercise Chameleon. It's a multinational exercise. And there's all sorts of military planes flying around, these C-130s, and I can't remember what the other ones you mentioned were, but certainly C-130s have this. I would think most military aircraft would have this flare defensive system. Certainly C-130s do. And we'll be taking a look at a C-130 or two firing off their defensive flares.
And the whole thing lit up really brightly.
And as I said, you know, this could be in the distance. This is three-dimensional, so she wouldn't be hearing the aircraft at this point.
The bottom lights became white-orange and illuminated so much, it illuminated parts of the side of the ship, showing that it was in fact a solid craft and not just a string of lights.
Now, not in this video, but she has described the craft as looking like a rock face. It's a bit wearing looking at this, to be perfectly honest, because it's very obvious there's nothing to it. Whether I can be bothered or not to find that clip, it's probably in another video. But she described it as looking like a rock face, and of course, you know, smoke billowing out of flares at night, being illuminated by the light from the flares, could very easily look like a rock face.
I so pleased it was like a hand of lightning that reached out to touch the ground, but it was more like a plasma ejection to try and stop it from itself from touching the ground.
Remember, she's still looking through trees.
The military planes coming.
Ah, yeah, and now she hears the military planes coming.
Two big C-17 planes, American planes. And I looked away for a moment as they flew over the top of me, and when I looked back, I couldn't see the pyramid anymore.
Yeah. So the planes are firing off flares in the distance. They're flying towards her. They're the fingers of lightning she saw. The planes fly over her head, and she turns around. The pyramid's gone because the military parachute flares have burnt out. This just really is. I don't know why this ridiculous story is getting any attention. It's smack you in the face obvious what she's describing.
But the green object was still there. A green object was moved from my left to my right in front of us. And there's two C-17s flying side by side.
Okay, well, I think we go off into a bit of a flight of fancy here. All right, well, let's have a look at a couple of clips of C-130s firing their defensive flares, and then we'll have a look at a couple of clips of military parachute flares being deployed, and we'll see how similar they look to what she's describing. Okay, so remember Kaz tells us that C-130s were flying around, the big American planes were flying around. This was at night, remember? Now, this scene here is not at night, but just imagine there's one of these C-130s. You know, I said the previous image was it was a two-dimensional depiction of a three-dimensional scene. So the fingers at the bottom of the triangle could very well have been something else in the distance in the background. The C-130s flying around, I think it could very easily have been, or it's far more likely to have been, something like this. Yeah, I think, you know, there's a military exercise going on, the C-130's flying around. There's probably a lot of flares around. She's looking at parachute flares. What she's describing is a very typical dispersion of parachute flares. I'll show you a couple of clips of those, but they do form, often form triangles with a curved bottom. So I don't think there's any doubt that what she actually saw was parachute flares, and that when she said she saw a structure, what she's seeing is the underside of the parachute is illuminated by the flares. But the fingers at the bottom, I reckon, was going to be one of these things. Remember, it's at night in the background. She probably wouldn't be able to see or hear the aircraft. It could be a mile or two behind the parachute flares she was looking at, which is why it would be low to the horizon, and she wouldn't see the aircraft or hear it, or maybe not even see any of that smoke. But there you go, C-130 firing off some flares there. So I think that will be what Kaz saw in the background. That would explain the fingers of light at the bottom of the triangle. One of these things low to the horizon because it was in the distance at night. And she said herself that the C-130s were there and they were flying around. That's a C-130 firing off some flares. Okay, on with the next clip. Okay, let's have another look at a C-130 firing off all of its defensive flares. Remember, they can fire the downward ones, the upward ones, and the side-facing flares individually. This is just a demonstration of a C-130 firing all of them at the same time. Seeing something like this at night, big military exercise going on. Yeah, lots of plasma fingers there, aren't there? If there's one of these a few miles away, yeah, in the background, I think that's going to be pretty. That's a down to earth, a down to earth explanation for what Kaz saw. I think it's far more likely to be a C-130 doing something like this than it being an alien spacecraft, personally. Especially an alien spacecraft that appears for a few seconds and then in the middle of a military exercise and then disappears when all this is going on. Makes no sense whatsoever. All right, well, I'll include this clip. I think it's only a short one, but it's just another down to earth demonstration of a C-130 firing off its defensive flares. And I think at night, a few miles away, coming towards her, she wouldn't hear the aircraft. She said the aircraft flew over a couple of minutes later, or very shortly afterwards. So that's exactly what she would see. That would be the fingers of lightning, an explanation for the fingers of lightning. Okay, on with a look at the parachute flares and the pyramid shapes they form as they're falling. Okay, let's have a look at some military parachute flares. Now remember Kaz's description. You know, there was 1, then there was 3, then there was 5. So here's a military parachute flare. Splitting up into a number of different flares. They're on parachutes, so the motion is a little like falling leaves. There's the pyramid shape that Kaz describes. Remember, she said it was curved at the bottom. Now, this particular flare doesn't contain quite as many flares, but if you could imagine, you know, there was a couple of extra flares here, a couple of extra flares there, you know, another one there, another one there, so different model of flare with a few more flares in it. It's going to look exactly as Kaz described. And as the camera's not focusing on this very well, but as the parachute flares continue to fall and rotate on their parachutes, it could give the impression that it's rotating, and of course then they burn out. Remember, she looked away as the aircraft flew over her head. She looked back and they were gone. So I think that's a pretty good example of parachute flares. And I'll leave a link to this video below, and you can look at it yourself. There you go. I think that's Kaz's pyramid, without a doubt. That will be the pyramid Kaz Clark is describing. All right, let's just have another quick look at some parachute flares, again forming a triangular shape with a curve at the bottom, and then we'll have a look at the rest of what she's got to say. This is another video, military flares. This has got fewer flares in it again, but we can still see the typical triangular pattern. There we go, it's launched. There's the 1 into 3 into 5. And again, there's it doesn't have as many flares in it, but there is the typical curved at the bottom triangular pattern of military parachute flares. So yeah, I think without a doubt what Kaz is describing is military parachute flares forming a triangular pattern curved at the bottom. She was standing on a gate to get a better view at it. She was looking through, she describes bare trees because it was winter. She didn't have a clear view of it. You know, the fingers of lightning, obviously an aircraft in the distance firing off defensive flares. I've said it before, I think, in this video, but I put a line through this. I watched this some time ago, and I put a line through it as being, you know, someone being overawed by a military exercise on their doorstep, and I think that's very obviously what it is. Certainly not an alien spacecraft, not a UFO. So I think it's pretty safe to put a line. Well, actually, it's extremely safe to put a line through the Pentyrch UFO incident. I think I'll call this video actually the Pentyrch UFO non-event, because that's exactly what it is. Right, let's just have a look at a few more things that Kaz mentions in her presentation about the airspace and about the radar pictures. And then mercifully we can and of course Gary Jones's residual EM tracking, EM field tracking. We've got to mention that. We can put a line through that. Of course, the electromagnetic fields are not residual. It's using a 2-bob toy from eBay to measure the electromagnetic field. And I'll show you that clip, and I'll tell you why it's a really bad idea to do that. And I don't know, I might even be able to show you a professional piece of equipment that might be used for doing something like that. We'll have a look and see what's lying around. Okay, on with the next clip. Right, Now, just as Ben Emlyn-Jones told us in his last video that he's becoming so well known now that he has to wear a disguise. The same is true for myself. As you can see, I'm wearing a cunning disguise. Right, now, I was going to continue with this Pentyrch UFO video today, but I do have a lot of things to do. Apparently, according to the weather forecast, tomorrow it's going to be raining, so I may well be spending a bit of time inside tomorrow. That being the case, I'll make a part 2 of this, and hang on, I made some notes here. What we're going to be looking at. What will I be looking at in part 2? Of course, it's too dark to actually see it. The usual Steve mumbling quality production values here. Okay, so men with the comms gear in the field that had guns that told her they were Vodafone. I don't know whether it's worth... actually, I could deal with that one now. That would just be military comms people that couldn't be bothered talking to a civilian because they were busy. I can put a line through that one. Men in the field were scrambling around and they were overheard saying, "We have to find it." Well, we've only got Kazzy's word for that's what she heard, is one point. The other point is that may very well be true. They may well have been scrambling around in a field trying to find a flare casing, you know, or some an ammunition casing that was used. Big military exercise, remember. They can't leave any of that lying around because, you know, if a member of the public or a kid picks up a used flare casing, it could potentially, the contents could be toxic. So that would explain that. So if that's true, that would be a down-to-earth explanation for that. Finding, you know, used ordnance or flare casings, that sort of stuff, just to get that. That would also explain the clearing all the metal out of the field, because they'd have to find all of it. And of course they're going to stumble across other metal stuff while they're doing their search, and they'd pile it up neatly so it could be collected. Nothing out of the ordinary there. The strange snow, residue from the flares. Down-to-earth explanation for that one. I don't think we've seen any pictures of the strange snow. I don't think Kaz has told us that she got a sample and got it analysed. We've only got a word for it that she saw the strange snow. She said it didn't melt. So if it didn't melt, why haven't we seen a sample? Probably just flare residue. So down-to-earth explanation for that. Put a line through that. Now, there was a couple of other things. Yeah, snap trees. Again, I think I might deal with that in part 2, because I'd like to show you some images of the snap trees, but she said they were snapped by something coming in and hitting them. It's more likely that they were snapped by some sort of ordnance. She said she could smell sulphur. There was a smell of sulphur in the air. They were snapped, you know, fairly low to the ground. They were quite tall trees, maybe halfway up. Yet the trees are lying on the ground, and there doesn't appear to be any damage to the canopy. You know, so nothing hit the tops of the trees. If something coming in fast and hitting with enough force to snap the trees would have completely destroyed the tree canopies. So we'll have a look at that, I think, in part 2. The polygraph, yeah. Personally, I don't think that carries any weight. I don't think there's any specific details relating to the polygraph, who did it, where it was done. I don't think it can be verified, can it? It was not a real... I don't think it was a real polygraph, because a real polygraph to me is somebody sitting in a chair and being asked specific questions about the incident. We haven't seen that, so... I wouldn't pay any mind to that. Now, I think what we'll look at in a little more detail in part 2 is... Oh, and Gary Jones mentioned the flight from Northolt. I might show a clip of Gary Jones if I can find it, where he says, "Oh, nothing ordinary ever happens from. No, there's never ever any ordinary flights from Northolt." That's absolute rubbish, of course. It's used routinely by the military all the time to fly in and out to military exercises and military bases from the HQ in London. So, you know, that's just Gary Jones trying to create a little bit of intrigue. You can put a line through that one. That's just nonsense. Kaz tells us the entire country's airspace was closed. Well, being from London, the entire country means to me the UK, not just Wales. So a bit of embellishment there. That could have been a genuine mistake on her part. We'll have to see if she continues to say that in her presentations. Now, she's offered no evidence for the entire airspace of Wales being closed, and she's shown us what she calls some radar pictures of some military planes flying around. Obviously, they're on a top-secret mission because they have their ADS-B transponders on, their beacons on, so that everyone and his dog can see where they are, how fast they're going, what their headings are, how high they are. They can tell exactly what they're doing. Certainly if they're on some sort of secret mission, they're not going to be having the beacons, the ADS-B beacons on, the ADS-B transponders on. That's just ridiculous. So, okay, so we'll look at one or two of those things in a little more detail. Oh, and I think I've got a clip somewhere of either Kaz or Gary Jones saying there was no NOTAM issued for this military exercise Chameleon that went on. I'll leave a link to military exercise Chameleon at that time. But then I found an FOI, Freedom of Information request, from Gary Jones showing a NOTAM. And unfortunately, a lot of it's obscured, so we can't actually see what the precise area it covers. But and I suspect the reason for that is that if he showed all of it, we would see very clearly that it doesn't cover the whole of the airspace of Wales. So we'll be having a look at that in a little more detail, and I'll show you the corner of the NOTAM that Gary Jones shows on his Freedom of Information request. And of course, Gary Jones, not being the sharpest tool in the shed, sent them a whole list of questions for his Freedom of Information request and they lumped them all together and said they couldn't give him any answers, whereas if he'd have asked one specific question and then another on different requests, then they would have had to have dealt with them individually. But the problem with these UFO investigators is there's an obvious bias, a very obvious bias. Now, I'm an investigator, and I try and look at it, and I would love to see something that convinced me there was something extraterrestrial to one of these stories. But I look at it from the Occam's razor point of view. What is most likely here? Could this possibly be an alien spacecraft? Or is it more likely to be this? That's the way I look at it. Whereas the UFO investigators, like Gary Jones and Ben Emlyn-Jones, they have such a heavy bias in favour of alien visitation that Gary Jones will get his EM meter out, wander around in a field, look at reflections from his mobile phone signal in his pocket probably, and say, oh yeah, there's a residual EM field from a spacecraft here, yeah, it's just ridiculous. It's unfortunate, but it's ridiculous. And it shows them up to be very poor investigators. So very, very, very little credibility, I think, should be given to anything coming from the Swansea UFO network. All right, well, let's wrap this one up here. As I say, it's quite a nice day today. I have things to do, so I'm going to have to call it on this one. And it's going to be raining here in Perth tomorrow. So that's Perth, Australia, not Perth, Scotland. And we're in autumn now, so we're just starting to get the beginning of the wet weather. We're getting a few showers coming through tomorrow, so if it's not going to be a very good day tomorrow, then I may spend some time doing a part 2. If you struggled all the way through part 1, congratulations as always. Thanks for watching, and hopefully I can get you part 2 before too long.